I'm going to take us back to California and start with an anecdote, but then get a little bit into some of the incentive structure questions that the example raises, although in an entirely different realm. So California's state waters are home to a network of 120 marine protected areas. They're scientifically designed. They, by law, are supposed to be adaptively managed as a network, so we don't just care how each individual MPA performs. We're interested in the overall impact of this new conservation initiative on state waters and ocean ecosystems in California. Of course, understanding that is difficult scientifically. Monitoring to understand the impact of this is a very complex scientific question, and it's a very long-term question. And the organization I've just been with, the Ocean Science Trust, is part of a public-private partnership formed to do that monitoring. And so the anecdote is from a community meeting down in Morro Bay, central coast of California. We were in the midst of a long process to update the Central Coast MPA monitoring plan, about as unsexy as you could imagine. No one cares about monitoring. It's boring. It's not scientifically interesting. It's impossible to fund. It feels like it's going to be drawing resources forever. And part of this public-private partnership was to develop some hypotheses around what might counteract those typical truths about monitoring. And I'd say, we're still asking those questions and seeing how it goes. But at this community meeting, we were asking for input about what should be in the Central Coast MPA monitoring plan, because these plans are boundary objects. They have extensive scientific input. They balance that with the state priorities, especially the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but also community input. So we're at the Museum of Natural History in Morro Bay in this little meeting room, and more than 70 people are packed in there. And typically what you get at a community meeting like this is scientists saying, fund my science. You get community members saying, I really care about otters, or I really care about whales, which is great, like nothing wrong with that. And you get fishermen standing up and saying, I hate MPAs. I'm being very overgeneralized here. But an interesting thing happened at this meeting, which is that fishermen who had been part of something called the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Project, which is a collaborative fisheries program, but it's very much in the mold of some other kinds of citizen science programs you see. They had been going out with scientists and doing monitoring in recent years, and they stood up and gave this impassioned speech about wanting this program to continue its funding because it was important that we know about whether these MPAs are working or not. And that just kind of made a little light go off in my head, because it wasn't just that we had fishermen who were supportive of an aspect of policy implementation, even though the fundamental policy was something they generally disagree with. It's also that you had people from a community standing up and becoming part of a constituency for a monitoring program rather than like a species. Whether it was relevant to the monitoring program or not. And that's what has gotten me thinking about what this huge groundswell around citizen science might mean for this community where we're talking about useful science and the science policy interface. And for those who aren't as familiar with it, citizen science is this contested, catch-all term. There are many other terms for it. It takes many, many forms. It can be communities participating in an environmental justice movement and bringing science into that, or conducting their own science, or it can be scientists themselves accessing the crowd, rain gauges in your backyard, scuba diving in the reefs, what have you. So it means a lot of different things. But if I sort of come back to first principles and think about the incentive structures that we all kind of bump up against all the time. I mean, Susie, you were talking earlier today about wanting to transform science. And it seems to me that if there is this huge groundswell around citizen science, enthusiasm for what it might mean for education outcomes, for environmental stewardship, for the ability to ask scientific questions in new ways, what you have is a lot of pressure for people to jump into a new set of relationships that they're not used to engaging in much the same way that our community is asking people to engage in those kinds of relationships. But it's a little different because this is about the scientific opportunity of volunteers participating in your science, as opposed to needing to understand what the needs are so that you can meet those needs. So this is all theoretical, right? There's a lot of, there's more and more talk about useful citizen science in the literature, and frankly, it's not all that sophisticated at this point. I mean, I've been part of it, so I think I can say that. They could learn a lot from this community. But what I'm wondering is, does citizen science create new reasons to collaborate with non-scientists? And are there ways that this community can capitalize on that? Does it create new avenues for bringing people and communities into management and policy through these sorts of monitoring programs? And does it also help us to shake up the lines of accountability in science in general, which I think is something that we're interested in. That's part of what we're doing in these different efforts. And if there are ways that scientists are incentivized to jump into that experience, I think what Anne was describing is another example of it. It's something where I think we could find some synergy. So that's my example and my vision that is very, very in the early stages of being formed.
Clarifying question. So what came out of that Morbay meeting? Like, what are they going to monitor now? Is it different from what one would otherwise do?
Well, we actually had 3 of those meetings up and down the Central Coast. We had packed rooms in all 3 of them. The resulting monitoring plan definitely has things in there that came from those meetings, things that came from lots of other meetings with scientists and agency officials. The plans become state policy. They become a touchstone for decision-making about investments in monitoring. So as always with these kinds of things, you have to draw sort of a long, tortuous line, but the documents themselves have a certain recognition that they wouldn't without this process. And they've been well received, I could say. I don't know that I would say that everyone in those communities is jumping for joy about them, but we don't get a lot of negative feedback. Yeah.
What was the entry point for the fishermen to participate in the citizen science component?
This is an initiative of 2 professors, one at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, one at the Moss Landing Marine Lab, who have over years developed relationships with different fishermen in these communities and with boat captains, for that matter. And they've started to slowly build a community of people who trust that this program is doing good work, is listening to them about certain sorts of techniques and information about where to go for different things, and then they all come together every year to go over the data together. So that's been building over years, and anyone can sort of put their hand up and say, I'd like to go out on a cruise, and it's just a question of finding a slot that's open. So there isn't a barrier to entry, although they try to focus on people with a lot of experience fishing.
I'm curious, is their interest in going along on the boat besides the fun, this aspect of it, because they're concerned that the NPA is damaging their take, or is it to prove that the NPA is working to increase their take? In other words, their limits, what they can fish for.
It varies from person to person, but I'd say both of those things are out there. There are people who are more or less supportive of it because they do believe that it's important to have this sort of long-term sustainability and that NPAs can play a role in that. I think most of them are concerned about that. There's varying levels of trust in whether NPAs are a mechanism to lead to that. I should say I picked one example of a citizen science project that's participating in this program, but there are several others which are sort of all forming interesting case studies of different kinds. School groups, scuba divers, lobster fishermen, etc.